the modern world, we tend to imagine that there's a radical opposition between people who do and people who think. There are those who get stuff done, leaders, businessmen, executives, and those like college professors at liberal arts colleges who don't. And too often doers have contempt for thinkers, while thinkers have disdain for those who participate in the active life. But as we have begun to see, Dante works hard to explode these categories. And in the Heaven of the Sun, for example, we saw that Dominic is called that great athlete, that man who vigorously campaigned to destroy opposition to the church, clearly a doer. But Dante, through the mouth of Bonaventure, adds that he did so through teaching and learning. And for this reason, Dante says that he went forth both with learning and with zeal. Dominic could not have arrived at his successful activity if it were not for his learning. Most of us can comprehend that there's some necessary intellectual training needed for being successful in the practical sphere of activity. But Dante, as he always does, takes the next step, and by doing so reveals a blind spot we have in contemporary American culture. For Dante, it's not just that intellectual work is necessary for successful activity, but that thinking is actually productive. Thinking is something, even when it's not primarily aiming to solve a problem or build a bridge. Under the right conditions, contemplation is an activity which is valuable, productive, and moving. These interesting ideas about the activity of contemplation are most evident in the heaven of Saturn, the heaven of the stars, and the crystalline sphere, each of which we'll talk about today. Let's begin at the very end of the canti we read for today to illustrate the point, Paradiso 28 and 29, the heaven of the crystalline sphere. In Dante's cosmology, there is a heavenly sphere, the outermost part of the universe, which enfolds even the sphere of the stars. What Dante and his contemporaries called the primum mobile, or the crystalline sphere. It's the most vital, dynamic, energetic thing in the whole of the universe. It moves faster than anything on earth, bounding forward without ever slowing, like a great wheel of a machine upon which all the other gears and wheels depend. It turns everything else. The chief drive shaft, which is responsible for beginning that process, according to which energy from heaven slowly trickles down from sphere to sphere and then is sowed in diverse combinations in terrestrial creatures. Thus, as Beatrice describes it, the world's like an upside-down flower pot whose roots are in the highest heaven, that is, the crystalline sphere, and whose flowers and fruits show up down below on earth. The nature of the universe which holds the center still and moves all else around it starts from here as from its boundary line. This heaven has no other where but in the mind of God, in which is kindled the love that turns it and the power it pours down. Light and love enclose it in a circle as it contains the others. How time should have its roots in a single flower pot and its foliage in all the others may now become quite clear to you. Dante means for this poetic vision of the crystalline sphere, moving in all of its rapidity, to be a dazzling sight, one so moving that it would make all else seem paltry in comparison. And thus, as so often throughout the canti of Paradiso, this awe-inspiring view of heaven is so attractive that it leads to an outburst of anger when Beatrice contemplates the blindness of mankind and our pathetic contentment with the mud and puddles of earth. Beatrice thus warmly abuses the greed of men on earth in the very next passage. O greed! It is you who plunge all mortals so deep in your depths that not one has the power to lift his eyes above your waves. The will of man bursts in blossom, but the never-ceasing rain reduces the ripening bloom to blighted rot. Greed is the excess which causes the blooms of the flowers to spoil. But the greatest surprise of all is what Dante sees in the next canto, Canto 29, in the midst of the turning wheel of the crystalline sphere. Dante sees a point, a kind of hole of nesting circles within this larger circle. And within this point, Dante sees 9 rings, which run in reverse order, as it were, to the great spheres of heaven. Here's how Dante describes the sight. It's a lengthy passage, but I want to quote it in full. My eyes were struck by what appears on that revolving sphere, if one but contemplates its circling. I saw a point that flashed a beam of light so sharp the eye on which it burns must close against its piercing brightness. As near perhaps as a halo seems to be when it encircles the light that colors it, where the vapor that forms it is most dense, there whirled about that point a ring of fire, so quick it would have easily outsped the swiftest sphere circling the universe. The ring was encircled by another ring, and that by the third by the fourth by the fifth, and the fifth by the sixth. Higher there followed in the seventh now spread so wide, so too the eighth and ninth. Each one revolving more and more slowly the farther it was, wheeling from the first. And that one least removed from the blazing point of light possessed the clearest flame, because I think it was the one that is the most entruthed by it. My lady, who saw me in grave doubt, yet eager to know and comprehend, said, From that point are strung the heavens and all nature. Observe that circle nearest it, and understand its motion is so swift, because it is spurred on by flaming love. Per l'affocato amore. In other words, Dante sees the 9 choirs of angels as described by Dionysius the Areopagite in his celestial hierarchy. According to Dionysius, the seraphim are able to look most deeply into the ocean of fire of God's being, because they're spurred on by flaming love. They then occupy themselves almost exclusively with that act of looking. However, something of the warmth of that vision, say 10%, spills over, as it were, into the second tier of the hierarchy, the cherubim, who in turn communicate their vision to the thrones. And then follows a second group of 3 ranks, dominions, virtues, powers. And the third group of 3 is made up of principalities, archangels, and angels. The lowest tier of the hierarchy, the angels, are chiefly responsible for delivering this vision, for taking it out. They're the most active, as it were, as if they spend 10% of their time looking and 90% of their time taking the vision out to the world. And so Dante's vision of a hierarchy of contemplation is one of motion being generated by looking. And because the vision of God is so stirring, there's a love which is enkindled in the heart of the one who sees, the one who contemplates. And then there's a released a kind of spiritual radioactivity, like the energy which issues forth from an atom when it's split. Or, to put it in more human terms, it's a little bit like when you have received the best news you possibly could hope for. On the one hand, the mere revelation of the news is nothing more than the communication of information, but it creates a kind of burning energy in your heart and mind which can be recognized by all around you as a heightened level of motion. Thus, for Dante, love literally moves the world, because the movement of the crystalline sphere is the result of the looking or contemplation enjoyed by the angels within it. The angels closest to God have the most immediate vision of Him, a vision which they transmit to successively lower orders. And this enthusiasm of vision ultimately spills over and outside of the tiered hierarchy of angels into the motion of the greatest wheel of heaven. And then, as we have said, this great wheel turns all the others. In this way, Dante gives us a picture of a universe whose greatest wheel is turned by the smallest, that is, the primo mobile, moving in all of its dazzling speed, is moved ultimately by the loving gaze of the seraphim, who see the most of God. Far from the worthless activity it is sometimes called, then, contemplation for Dante moves all other activities in the cosmos. Love literally moves the universe. When I read these words to one of my students, he immediately said, "Wow, that's a beautiful idea, but how could human beings with their finite intellects ever participate in such a profound act of intellectual seeing?" And I said to him, "This is why I love Dante's description of the heaven of Saturn so much. I told you in an earlier lecture that my favorite character in the comedy is Piccarda. Well, my favorite passage in the comedy is Paradiso 21 to 22, those Conti dedicated to describing Dante's experience on Saturn, precisely because the poet gives us a picture of human beings engaged in this act of intellectual looking or contemplation. He also gives us a few hints about how these contemplatives managed to get to that profound gaze of love. According to ancient and medieval astrological theory, Saturn could have a pernicious influence on people on Earth. If you were born under the sign of Saturn, then chances are you're melancholic, irritable, morose, and interior. Poets and artists are born under the sign of Saturn, as Dürer brilliantly captured in a series of engravings on melancholy. But Dante gives us a rather more positive interpretation of what your husband's Saturnine disposition would look like if perfected. That irritable tendency to withdraw, to be alone, that frustrated spirit about everyone's faults, here is revealed for what it could be, a world of profound peace, a spiritual power to be attentive to and delight in that which is true. If you think about it, in a world like ours, which is only able to measure productivity by growth or importance through its exchange value, we would be tempted to think that those who remain still are doing nothing. But Dante shows us it's just the opposite. These are the people who actually know what to do when the workday has ended. They have a depth, an ability to know God and one another, a density of being which makes them powerfully attentive, and a gravity which makes the rest of us sadly look like bits of paper blown by wintered winds through the empty streets of a big city, as T.S. Eliot might put it. And the narratival way that Dante makes us feel their density of being, the profound depths of tranquility of the souls of Saturn, is extraordinary. The heaven of Saturn opens in Canto 20 with eerie stillness. There is no smiling, there is no singing, there is no sound. The pilgrim is perplexed. All he sees is a golden ladder with thousands of sparks raining silently down. Quote, the color of gold, an array of sunlight. I saw a ladder rising to so great a height, my eyesight could not rise along with it. I also saw descending on its rungs so many splendors that I thought that every light shining in the heavens was pouring down. Soon one of these splendors draws near to Dante. This is Peter Damian, a reforming Benedictine monk of the 11th century. And Beatrice encourages Dante to ask of Peter any question he might wish to have answered. Dante's first question, then, is about the silence of this place. Tell me why within this wheel the sweet symphony of paradise falls silent, which lower down sounds with such devotion. And Peter responds, your hearing is as mortal as your sight. Thus, here there is no song, for the very reason Beatrice has not smiled. Earlier, Beatrice had explained to Dante that if she smiled, Dante would, quote, become what Semele became when she was turned to ashes. For my beauty, she continues, is so resplendent that were it not tempered, in its blazing your mortal powers would be like tree limbs rent and scorched by lightning. In other words, behind the veil of silence is not a lack of beauty or a lack of sound, but a music so powerful and profound that it would destroy a mind too feeble to encounter it, like a vast amount of water in a reservoir, which exerts so many tons of pressure against a dam that the walls have to be 20 or 30 feet thick to hold back its force. And at the end of this canto, Dante gives us just a glimpse of what would happen if the pressure did break forth. Toward the end of Canto 21, Peter Damian, who had once been a cardinal himself, begins to grow angry about how the office of cardinal is mistreated in Dante's day. Peter abuses those who would hold the office in a greedy and luxurious way. Their fur-lined mantles, he sarcastically grumbles, hang upon their horses' flanks, so that two beasts go underneath one skin. Oh, patience, what a heavy load you bear. And all of those justice-loving melancholic souls in the heaven of Saturn listening keenly all agree. As he spoke, I saw more flickering flames descend, spinning from rung to rung, and every time more lovely. They thronged around him, and then they stopped and raised a cry so loud that nothing here could compare to it, nor could I make it out. So did its thunder overwhelm me. It's almost a humorous moment. The poet portrays the pilgrim as if he were a child, frightened at the thunder. But from our perspective, we realize that this brief outbreak of voices demonstrates how much these souls are holding back. Beatrice explains in the next canto, "Overcome by wonder, I turn to my guide, as does a child who always scurries back to the one who had his utmost trust. And she, like a mother, quick and comforting her son when he is pale and out of breath, with a voice that has often calmed him in the past, said, 'Don't you understand that you are in heaven? Don't you understand that all of heaven is holy, that all things done here spring from righteous zeal? It should be clear to you just how their song and then my smile would have confused you, since you were so startled by their cry.'" As we have said, everyone, including Beatrice, is holding back. But at the same time, as we have also said, this is not a silence due to inactivity. Rather, Dante weaves these details in and out of his canto, careful to keep giving us glimpses of the spiritual energy which is held back. For instance, when Peter Damian hears Dante's question, he grows excited with a breathtaking joy. "I had not quite finished my words when the light began to spin around its core, whirling like a quickly turning millstone." As we have also seen, because these souls love so much, they're able to grow furious with the unjust. Remember, too, the golden ladder, which one ascends and descends at lightning speed. And finally, it's interesting to add that later in Paradiso, Bernard is called he who, quote, "still within the confines of this world, in contemplation tasted of that peace." But that peace, as we also hear, is boiling hot, as in Bernard's words. "And heaven's queen, for whom I burn with love, will grant us every grace, since I am her own faithful Bernard." In a world which can only measure growth in terms of increase of the GDP, Dante's depiction of these contemplatives is brilliant. It helps us see them as powerful in thought. But we should point out that for Dante, there is a huge difference between his contemplatives and the bearded Greenwich Village poet, because Dante's contemplatives understand that you can only get to that level of depth of spirit by extraordinary spiritual discipline. In fact, there's a long tradition of referring to contemplatives as athletes of God, sacrificing everything in a spiritual training program. Thus, although it is true that their pure thinking, their contemplation, has a dynamic movement, it is also true that they had to discipline themselves and their lives before they were able to see. For Dante, contemplatives are not just people who like to read and think and write, but people with a kind of muscular devotion to the intellectual and moral life. Peter Damian sums up his life in this way. "There I became so constant," the word he uses is fermo, firm like a rock, "in serving God, my simple fare seasoned with olive oil alone, that I readily endured the heat and frost, content in contemplative thoughts." In order, that is, to find the liberty to dwell steadfastly in those pensieri contemplativi, those contemplative thoughts, Peter had to first reach an impressive level of discipline, like that of a D1 athlete who gets up every morning at 5 to go to the gym and only eats what his trainer prescribes to him, whether he's hungry or not. The contemplative, then, is like an athlete with his mind, willing to undertake discipline in order to get to the point where he can move and perform with grace. In the next canto, Benedict adds this, "Peter started his community with neither gold nor silver, and I mine with fasting and with prayer." But what I want to point out is that Dante also suggests that such fasting was a fundamental component of his poema sacro, his sacred poem. In Paradiso 25, Dante refers to his, quote, "sacred poem, to which both heaven and earth have set their hand, so that it has made me lean for many years." In other words, the very process of study, reading, thinking, meditating, digesting, and then carefully finding the perfect words to express the conception within his heart is likened by Dante to a great intellectual fast, to a disciplined use of study, language, and books. In Paradiso 19, he asked the eagle a question, begging that the eagle breathe forth and free me from this fast that ever keeps me famished, since I can find no food for it on earth. You might remember, too, that Dante referred to his literary work toward the end of the Purgatorio in similar terms, as a great intellectual fast. Just as his Purgatorio is gearing up to deal with the most difficult and abstract, apocalyptic visionary experience, he pauses to call for divine assistance. O sacred virgins, if fasting, cold, or sleepless nights, fame, freddi, or vigiliae, I've ever suffered for your sake, necessity drives me to call me for my reward. In other words, consistently through the comedy, Dante uses the metaphor of fasting for his intellectual activity. And why is that? It would seem that Dante is attracted to the metaphor, both because the inherent property of hunger, that is, a longing for things which cannot be easily satisfied by ordinary fare, as well as on account of the discipline, control, and moderation needed in developing the ability to be nourished by the best books and the richest ideas. In stark contrast to this intellectual fasting is our consumerist and entertainment-based approach to information. For example, when I was in the airport the other day, watching a trivial celebrity news show on television, I began counting 1, 2, 3, and noticed that every time before I got to 3, the camera angle cut to a new one, zoomed out or zoomed in. In other words, almost every 2 seconds, the visual makers have to change the shot to make sure those watching don't get bored. In the meantime, you have impressed upon you images of smiling, gorgeous people. But it's all fake. Fake joy, manufactured lives, canned and packaged to sell you things you don't need or want. And most importantly, moving so swiftly that you'll never have enough time to ask yourself whether or not you're really happy. Consumerism then feeds you, anticipating any craving long before it arises to keep you from ever experiencing any meaningful hunger. What a contrast to the slow, patient reading and rereading which leads to greater intellectual hunger, intellectual leanness to an alert mind, to that kind of reading needed to absorb and slowly chew on a book like Dante's. In fact, medieval monastic culture used this very image of mastication, the slow chewing of a cow, to release the full flavor of the text. It's a reading which should be slow, a reading which should be followed by rereading, which goes even more slowly, a going over and over the words until they are clear, and then over them again until they are moving, and then again until they are in the memory, as if we were chewing, swallowing, and digesting, so that what was once foreign to you now becomes nourishment within your mind. And if you take this nourishment in the right way, then it leaves you more hungry than before, with a certain holy dissatisfaction and restlessness. But for Dante, of course, you can't just be a reader. You have to be a writer too. You must labor to find the language to express the vision of the truth you have gained. Dante wrote whole books about how he tried to get his words right, down to the very syllable. Thus, there's a necessary fast of the words of the mouth, using language which is not cliched, but fresh and vital. And then there's a fast of the eyes, reading, not for consumerist pleasure of entertainment, but the slow reading of study, with an eye open to depth, and with the expectation of remembering. As one of my colleagues put it, such intellectual fasting actually leads to a form of spiritual feasting. In Dante's day, the acknowledged experts in the practice of effecting such deep transformation were the monastic spiritual writers. They specialized in constructing exercises which led to this deep transformation. That is, exercises which souls became capable over time of not just assenting to truth, but to loving it, desiring it, responding with the heart. They were rather like personal trainers for the soul. They called such personalized exercise programs for the heart and mind disciplina claustralis, which we could loosely translate monastic exercise program. Here's how Peter of Cell describes it. Quote, "The true religious voluntarily and freely desires regular discipline in order to be tied back from the appetites of the flesh as if by bands. The bonds of religion are the regular statutes. For example, silence, fasting, and seclusion of the cloister, ways of acting which do not attract attention, compassion and fraternal love, paternal reverence, reading and persistent prayer, recollection of past evils, fear of death, the fire of purgatory, eternal fire. In a book which just came out a little over a decade ago, called Religious Reading, the theologian from Duke University, Paul Griffiths, begins his work with a particularly beautiful passage illustrating that such medieval practices are relevant today. He says, "So far as I can recall, I have always been able to read, to make sense of and be excited by written things. I know, of course, that there was a time when I could not read. It's just that I cannot remember it. But I was never taught and have still not properly learned how to read with careful, slow attentiveness. It's difficult for me to read with the goal of incorporating what I read, of writing it upon the pages of my memory. I find it hard to read as a lover, to caress, lick, smell, and savor the words on the page, and return to them ever and again. I read instead mostly as a consumer, someone who wants to extract what is useful or exciting or entertaining from what is read, preferably with dispatch, and then to move on to something else. My habits of reading are mostly like my habits of purchasing. Dazzled by the range of things I can buy, I spend all that I can as fast as I can, ecstatic at the excitement of contributing to the market economy, and satisfied if I can assure myself of a place in that economy by continuing to produce and consume. I'm not alone in this condition. Most academic readers are consumerist in their reading habits, and this is because they, like me, have been taught to be so and rewarded for being so." These stirring words, I think, capture well the contemplative spirit of those in Dante's Saturn and the disciplined approach to the intellectual life I have summed up by the idea of intellectual fasting. Well, we've discussed how the intellectual vision of the angels turns the gears of the universe, and how the contemplatives reach their profound depths of spiritual looking through the undertaking of intellectual fasting. This leaves for us one last heaven to discuss, the heaven of the stars. At the end of Canto 22, you'll remember that Dante approaches the golden ladder of the contemplatives, and as soon as he just sets his foot on the first rung, he's transported instantly, violently, and swiftly, thousands of miles up into the heaven of the stars. And from this vista, Dante looks down and sees, quote, "this globe of ours to be such that I smiled, so mean did it appear. That opinion which judges it as least, I now approve as best." The pilgrim further sees the rest of the heavens spread out beneath his feet. All 7 planets there reveal their sizes, their velocities, and how distant from each other their abodes. The little patch of earth that makes us here so fierce, from hills to river mouths, I saw it all while I was being wheeled with the eternal twins. Over the next 3 canti, Dante will be examined by Peter, James, and John on faith, hope, and charity. Dante models these examinations somewhat humorously on the medieval Bachelors of Art exam. Here Dante is the student, and his pesky professors are seemingly very difficult to please. In these oral exams, they keep prodding, asking him to say more. Beatrice says to Peter, for example, "Test this man as you see fit on points both minor and essential about the faith by which you walked upon the sea." And so while Peter is putting together the words for his question, the pilgrim gets himself ready. Quote, "Just as the bachelor arms himself and does not speak while the master is setting forth the question, so I armed myself with all my arguments." Dante is asked by Peter, "What is faith?" To which he gives a good catechism answer. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things that are not seen. But then Peter begins to probe him on particular key words in that definition. "And what about substance, Dante?" However, the examination reaches an interesting point when Peter changes the subject and the exam takes on a particularly poetic tone. Quote, "Now this coin's alloy and weight are well examined. But tell me if you have it in your purse. But at the end of this oral exam, when Dante has finished all his responses, which have also grown more and more poetic, his examiners respond, quote, "The high and holy court resounded through all its starry spheres with, 'Lord, we praise you.'" But Peter's even more excited. As the master to whom a servant brings good news, rejoices when he hears it, and puts his arm around the speaker just as soon as he is finished, thus blessing me as he sang the apostolic light, encircled me 3 times once I was silent, because my words had brought him such delight. So what kind of exam is this? What does Peter really want to know? I think that Peter wants to know not just that Dante holds the right answer, but that he possesses this for himself and as his own. The coin, as Dante puts it, is in his pocket. But furthermore, one of the characteristics of a virtue is, of course, not just holding a correct opinion, but possessing a power which in turn influences and has effect. Peter, for instance, asks Dante how he knows the Scripture is the revealed Word of God, and Dante replies, "For the world to have turned to Christ without miracles, that indeed was to outdo all other forms of proof 100-fold. Dante declares what he believes, stating, "I believe in one God, one and eternal, whom himself unmoved moves all the heavens with his love and their desire." In other words, he starts to recite the creed, but a vernacular creed, a creed in Italian, and translated into the rhythm and cadence and rhyme of poetry, as if the real demonstration of Dante's theological virtues is that he can move those around him, fit the raw matter of language and ideas into the shape and order of cosmic poetry. In other words, Peter doesn't want a definition for faith. He wants an act of faith. He wants the pilgrim to perform faith for him, to describe it poetically, in the sort of way in which it makes Peter want to have faith too. Just as the love poet tries to make the beloved share in his love, to perform in you what is happening in me, so too does Peter want to see Dante's faith working, performing, creating new faith. There can't be any parasites in heaven. To make it in, you have to be able to add to its love, making others even more glad, not just suck the vitality out of others. Thus we see in this exam the fruit which comes forth as the result of intellectual fasting. For Dante, you have to acquire not just the right opinions, you have to not just commit yourselves to them, but then you have to have the power to respond to them with your own words in a way which moves others in order to prove that you yourself have been moved by a vision of truth.